What is Hong Kong's future? Massive protests calling for democracy have shut down businesses and roads in the commercial hub. What are the implications for Hong Kong as a leading global financial center? Here in Singapore, I'm Linda Yu, and we're talking business. A warm welcome to the program. Students and Occupy protesters have taken to the streets in Hong Kong in the name of democracy. Thousands of demonstrators have occupied main thoroughfares in some of the busiest parts of the commercial hub, shutting down businesses and roads. It's the first significant test of the one country, two systems model since the handover in 1997, which returned Hong Kong from British to Chinese rule. Safeguarding its system of governance and economic freedom was the aim. The protesters are demanding a free choice of leader in 2017 and have rejected Beijing's version, where the candidates are pre-selected by the Chinese government. China, though, is resisting calls to change its stance. A lot is at stake, including Hong Kong's position as an international financial center. Hong Kong has the sixth largest stock market in the world and is the second largest after Tokyo in Asia. It's one of the most open economies in terms of the free flow of money and investment. So, what would these protests mean for Hong Kong's future? After all, part of the key to being a global financial center is having a stable system where investors are willing to put in billions into its market. It also requires being an attractive place for global talent to work and live. Our China editor, GRACIE, reported on how the financial sector reacted during the early days of the protests in Hong Kong.
This is the heart of the business and government district. Government headquarters there, the Parliament building there, behind the government headquarters, the Chinese People's Liberation Army headquarters. And all eyes currently on Beijing, a sense of unease about what their next step will be. But I'm also interested to understand what the financial workers of Hong Kong feel about this, because of course Beijing has said that one of the things against a big civil disobedience protest like this is that it'll damage Hong Kong's prosperity. So what do the bankers, what do the insurers, what do all the people who work for them, what do they feel about this democracy protest?
I think it's just the government trying to threaten us by saying the financial market is crashing down.
I think it's very peaceful, and I'm so sad because the police has to do this way to the peoples. I'm very disappointed about the government.
I mean, these demonstrations are far more important than any sort of day's work. This is about the long-term future of Hong Kong, freedom of speech, about being a little bit different to mainland China.
Just some of the voices in the financial sector here today. People coming to work, coming out of work at lunchtime. I've talked to a lot of them, and what is striking is that every single one of them supports the aims of these students.
So far, the credit rating agencies appear unfazed by the protests. Both Fitch and S&P have said that the rating for Hong Kong is unaffected at present by the demonstrations. To get more on what could affect Hong Kong's rating, I caught up earlier with Andrew Calhoun, head of Asia Pacific Sovereign Ratings at Fitch, who joined me from Hong Kong.
Fitch reviewed Hong Kong's ratings on the 15th of September, and at that time we affirmed the ratings at AA+ with a stable outlook. That was only 3 weeks ago, and at that time we anticipated the Occupy Central protests were coming. Obviously we couldn't anticipate exactly what shape they would take, but we knew something was coming. So that was, in a sense, priced into the rating, and what's happened over the last few days isn't news from a credit rating point of view.
Are there factors or triggers that you're keeping an eye on which could cause you to move Hong Kong's ratings?
Well, I think it's important to stress that we're providing a sovereign credit rating, which is to do with the chances of the government repaying its debt, and we're not providing a broader country risk rating. That's not to say that we ignore the protests or that they don't matter from our point of view. Of course they're important, or potentially important. I think in order to have a material negative impact on the rating, we would need to see the protests having a lasting, significant negative impact on Hong Kong's economy or financial stability. I mean, we already think that the economy will slow somewhat this year. We have about 2.2% for GDP growth penciled in. But from a credit point of view, our credit rating should be robust to normal cyclical ups and downs. So we need to see a sort of multi-year negative impact on trend growth prospects before we'd be considering negative rating action, or something else that might lead us to think again would be if there was substantial capital outflow from Hong Kong, if capital took fright at what was going on. But I think it's still very much a stretch to picture that kind of outcome happening.
Finally, what if it all goes terribly wrong and the protesters end up in a prolonged standoff with the Chinese government?
Well, we think it's very unlikely that kind of outcome. We could argue about definitions, but the bottom line, I think, from our point of view, is that we think the risk of the protests having a material, lasting negative impact on Hong Kong's economic or financial stability is very low and consistent with the rating at AA+ stable. Of course, all of our ratings are subject to review, and we'll keep the situation under review, and that judgment could change if the facts warrant. But for now, from where we're sitting at the moment, we think that's unlikely.
That was Andrew Calhoun. The protests have already raised questions over the economic future of Hong Kong. So, what are the implications for Hong Kong's standing as an international financial center? Joining me to discuss this are KARTHIK Rajan, Vice President of Public Sector and Government Practice at Frost & Sullivan; Joseph CHERIAN, Professor of Finance at the National University of Singapore; and FRASER HOWIE, Director at New Edge, a brokerage company. Welcome to all of you. Let me start with you, KARTHIK. Do these protests matter for Hong Kong's standing as a global financial center?
As a business destination, I don't think it's likely to have any long-term implications. Of course, in the short term, financial services institutes have to some of them have already enabled business continuity plans and so on. So I think in the short term, yes, there will be some inconvenience in a way, but in the long term, I don't think it will have a large impact on Hong Kong as a financial center.
What about you, Fraser?
Short term, obviously, there's been some impact, but even having said that, we have offices in Hong Kong, and barring the holidays, it's been business as usual. And so even though there is short-term disruption, it's disruption that people of Hong Kong are prepared to accept, because ultimately there's a bigger principle here. And being a business centre, being a good business centre, is not in conflict with having better governance in Hong Kong. So in that sense, I think this is it's been a long time in the making, this problem, and certainly in the immediate term it's not causing a problem. If the protests turn violent on either side, then that's going to send a very different message. But at the moment, these are some of the best behaved protesters probably ever seen, certainly in Asia and most certainly in Europe. So at the moment, minimal impact, frankly, as a business centre.
What about you, Joseph?
Well, I traditionally like roads to be cleared and, without disruption. So any disruption is viewed in an unfavorable manner for business. We do know there are statistics that reveal about $1 billion of tourism losses, in effect, because this is the peak tourism cycle because of the Chinese holidays and all that stuff. That's a heck of a lot of money to lose in a day. Tourism is a substantial part of Hong Kong's economy. So I'm worried about that, and I'm worried about another thing. Even if it remains passive and non-violent, will it repeat itself? Because this doesn't get resolved until the elections, which is, 2017? So we could see a repeat of this. That's what I'm more concerned about.
Is that a concern for you, Karthik?
I don't see China backing down on and letting on to what the protesters want wholly, but certainly one expects that some kind of a compromise, maybe reforms in the Legislative Council, maybe some kind of a greater interest shown by the Chief Executive should quell things, at least for the moment. To Joseph's point on whether this might repeat itself, well, yeah, it's been a long time in the making. It might still come up if unless it's addressed fully, at least to a compromise like in the Legislative Council. Maybe over the next 2 to 3 months, depending on how the negotiations go and how the sort of the common ground is reached, that would define whether this gets repeated.
Do you agree with that, Fraser?
I think, is it going to come back? Of course it's going to come back, because this isn't a soluble problem, because you ultimately have part of China, which has its own very unique history, Hong Kong, with a population which is now very politically aware, and are simply wanting greater freedom to choose their own leaders and have greater say in their control. They do not want greater influence from Beijing, whether it's overt or covert influence, they don't want it. And yet simply you have a Communist Party who is very bad at dealing with minority groups, and that ultimately is what Hong Kong is. You see it in other parts of China. They're unable to be flexible at all in terms of allowing ethnic minorities to run their own affairs. In Hong Kong, to some extent as well, they say, well, you're part of China, it's one country, and then two systems, not two systems in one country. And so they are very uncomfortable trying to deal with these issues. I think it's ironic that at a time when we're looking at China more broadly, and the reforms everyone's hoping that Xi Jinping is going to bring in, the real test case is Hong Kong. If there is ever a place in China where you could get real change in the Communist Party thinking, it's Hong Kong, because it's got a very different history, it's got a different set of laws, it's got a very different makeup from the rest of China. And yet here they seem so inflexible. And I think it's very difficult to see how this problem is not going to stay with us for a very long time. It's not just going to be the elections in 2017 or further elections. I think you have a fundamental problem that the Communist Party want to have a lot of control over Hong Kong, and yet the people of Hong Kong want to be able to run their own affairs. And neither side is budging on that. So therefore this problem is going to be with us for a long time.
Okay, I'm going to get more from my panel in just a moment. Later in the program, we hear from a Nobel Prize-winning economist who lives in Hong Kong about the lasting impact of the protests. Welcome back to Talking Business with me, Linda Yu. What is the economic impact of prolonged protests in Hong Kong? What type of resolution might be possible? I caught up with Nobel Prize-winning economist James Mirrlees, who lives in Hong Kong, to ask him about the likely effect on Hong Kong's economy.
Yeah, I have tremendous sympathy for the demonstrators, and I'm really relieved that so far I'm hearing that they're projecting an image of incredibly peaceful demonstration. But not that it's not causing any troubles, difficult for business to proceed. So what's going to happen? I suppose it's virtually bound to just kind of fade away, and maybe over a period of days, weeks, and months, and I find it awfully hard to guess which. But bound to be bad for business, I would have thought.
Is there a sense that perhaps Hong Kong, it could lose its standing as the gateway to China, and this is sort of the first step down that road?
It's clearly possible. And it seems to me that's what people were saying in 20 years ago, looking at what was going to happen at the handover, assuming that in various ways Shanghai could do anything that Hong Kong could do. Shanghai has grown a lot faster than Hong Kong, and the economic dimension as well as in population. But I'm struck that so much business in Shanghai and things like building development is actually being managed from Hong Kong, done by Hong Kong businesses. And they seem to feel that that's still going on fine. The question is, how much does Hong Kong, how much do ordinary Hong Kong people benefit from that business? That's where the doubts are, because of Hong Kong wages not rising. That seems clear evidence that they're not doing quite as well as they might have. Not quite as well as Singapore.
That was James Mirrlees. Still with me to discuss what the protests mean for Hong Kong's economic future are KARTHIK Rajan, Vice President of Public Sector and Government Practice at Frost & Sullivan, Joseph CHERIAN, Professor of Finance at the National University of Singapore, and FRASER HOWIE, Director at New Edge, a brokerage company. Before, we were having a discussion about the possible resolution or outcome of what these protests in Hong Kong might be. But I want us to now take a bigger picture look at where Hong Kong actually sits. So one statistic that has always struck me is that when Hong Kong rejoined China, it was a much more important part of the mainland Chinese economy. But now, of course, it's a much smaller part. And there's the rise of centers such as Shanghai. So I suppose one of the questions that the protests has raised is ultimately, where will Hong Kong sit? Where does it sit in China's future? Does China need Hong Kong? Fraser.
Obviously, Hong Kong used to be, as if you take a sort of GDP measure type thing, Hong Kong used to be a percentage, a bigger part of China. Of course, the pie has grown as well, so everyone's benefited from that. If you look at pictures of Shanghai 15 years ago, 17 years ago, it was very different from today, but so is Hong Kong. So it's not to say that Hong Kong hasn't benefited as well. I think part of just looking at the numbers at the quantity angle doesn't tell the whole story. I think there is a quality angle there, and there is, because of Hong Kong's unique experience, because it's very good legal institutions, framework of law, etc. It's a place where people are very comfortable doing business, where mainland business people are very keen to come and do business and invest their money because of the open financial markets, because of the ease of doing business. So Hong Kong has a unique position in that sense.
But is it a unique position that the Chinese government will look at and say we need to preserve?
No, I think that's the real tragedy. I think the Chinese government longer term just simply see it as yet another Chinese city. And I think that's the real worry for it.
Well, there's nothing preventing Shanghai from growing the rate at which it's growing and gaining in importance. I think it's inevitable that it will happen. But I still do feel Hong Kong has a role to play. And I'm not so sure the Chinese government has said this is not an important outpost for us. I think they view them as almost an exogenous outpost, which is a part of China as well, that outsiders feel comfortable using as a gateway into China. So my sense is it will not lose its significance, probably a little more diminished, but as Fraser pointed out, the economy, everyone's growing, everyone's doing well jointly. So while it will diminish, but the growth will, sort of compensate for that. But that said, if these, I'm an engineer originally, you got the initial condition wrong, it can lead to a very bad equilibrium. If these protests continue on, it won't be viewed favorably, not just by the Chinese, even the Westerners, the developed nations will not be looking at Hong Kong as a natural gateway because it will be considered as an unstable gateway. So that's my worry when the other people begin to view Hong Kong as less important.
Karthik, do you share that worry?
Well, I think I'm more with Joseph on this. I don't think China can afford to ignore Hong Kong per se, because even while they're developing Shanghai and other centers of in finance, Hong Kong has some very unique characteristics. Hong Kong is a offshore banking market, whereas Shanghai still has a long way to get there. Hong Kong has a large, what you call as the dim sum bond market, the yuan-denominated bonds. So that's a key attraction
but
for investors.
But aren't all of that based on having a much more established rule of law, right, and having very open borders, right, and having a stable governance system, which a lot of companies don't associate, obviously, with capital controls in China, and a rule of law which most would say is not effective.
But irrespective of what kind of changes happen from these protests, Hong Kong already has a more established rule of law, already has greater freedom of movement of people, and I don't see a reaction or a counterattack from China sort of sending Hong Kong back in reverse gear down that path. So it already has a great.
I don't think it's necessarily an active reverse, as it were. I think it's a slow chipping away at the status of Hong Kong. These things don't disappear overnight. That rule of law stays there. The analogy I gave is that 500 years ago, Venice was an absolute major economic power in the Mediterranean. Now it's a tourist destination. Okay, it's not even an economic power in Italy, and so you can see how something that was once special slowly gets eroded. And again, not because of any one particular protest, but just a slow chipping away at those freedoms and those things that have made it special.
Joseph, jump in.
Yeah, I just want to bring up, it's interesting we talked about Hong Kong having the edge because of its rule of law and all this stuff, but what we're seeing right now, perceptions from the outside world is, hey, maybe the rule of law is breaking down. For the right reasons maybe, but it's still from the business perspective, from the hedge fund manager's perspective, he wants to be able to walk in that central area, go to work freely, and he's not able to do that. So they begin to think alternatives, because I don't want any disruptions to my daily business. While I sympathize, I want that freedom and democracy and these young people have all these aspirations and be able to vote, but I want to make my business function. So that rule of law perception starts breaking down, right? And then they begin to look for alternatives. In fact, Singapore might begin to look more attractive to them when they say, I'm going to start a business in Asia. It may not be Hong Kong anymore. It could be Singapore and even Shanghai for that matter. And now I know a lot of fund managers who are actually thinking of Shanghai as an outpost.
I think the question, certainly sitting here in Singapore, the relative importance, not so much in China, but perhaps also in Asia for Hong Kong is important as well. And certainly I think there could be a slight gain for Singapore, but it's a very slight one, because ultimately Singapore is 1,500 miles away from China. As for Shanghai, I have to disagree. I think this program is lucky if it will be even broadcast in Shanghai. And certainly if you're the hedge fund manager and you have your story censored on Bloomberg because they're anti-Chinese, I hardly think that's the best place to do business. So China domestically is far from ready to replace Hong Kong in terms of that quality aspect.
It hasn't prevented some of the top hedge funds in the world in getting QDLP licenses, setting up offices, doing JVs. They want to do business in China, and Shanghai is their natural place. I'm not saying that it is,
drops in the ocean. An absolute failed program after 3 years of work.
These are all sort of steps that will lead to a bigger, we're talking decades here, not the next election.
For a new financial center, I think it's par for the course.
No,
the uptake is par
for 20
for the
years
course.
I've been following Chinese domestic stock markets.
They've just been 3 years since they've opened up the Shanghai Financial Center.
For 20 years I've been following the development of the domestic stock markets in China. It's been a very slow and torturous process. There's lots of little experiments that Shanghai does, but it's still a long way short of what
and capital markets is just another reason why Hong Kong is so important for China as well, because that's the conduit for capital markets and experimentation and reform and investment.
Great, thank you all very much indeed. That was FRASER HOWIE, KARTHIK Rajan and Joseph CHERIAN. Mass protests are by nature unpredictable. For Hong Kong, the calls for democracy have raised fundamental questions over how the special administrative region will be governed. And the answer to that question could have implications for Hong Kong's ability to retain its position as one of the leading global financial centers. That's all we have time for. Check out our website and me on Twitter. I'm at Linda Yu, and join us next time for more Talking Business with me, Linda Yu.